Assalamu alaikum. This is Hena Zuberi, and you're watching Muslim Network News. Our top story: cyber attacks are the same as armed attacks, according to NATO. This declaration was issued Tuesday in the communique at the end of the 31st NATO summit. In a serious development in the peace movement, NATO says that cyber attacks are the same as armed attacks. This interpretation can be dangerous, though. Article 5 of NATO's 1949 treaty states that if one NATO ally is under attack, it is an attack on all. NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is a military alliance of 30 nations. The new policy stance follows high-profile attacks on U.S. fuel distribution company Colonial Pipeline and JBS Meatpackers. Both paid millions of dollars in ransom to the attackers. 3 United States House Republicans have introduced a resolution to censure and condemn 4 Democratic House members. Often referred to as the Squad, the 4 are Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Ayanna Pressley. The resolution rests primarily on controversy surrounding Omar's tweet in relation to an international criminal court case involving the U.S., Israel, the Taliban, and Hamas. Detractors have said that Representative Omar was equating war crimes committed by the U.S. and Israel to those of terrorist groups. Omar has since released multiple statements clarifying her tweet. She explained that it referred to the specific case before the ICC and was not a moral comparison between Hamas and the Taliban and the United States and Israel. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and her leadership team last week issued a rare joint statement supporting Omar's explanation. The resolution against the Squad was sponsored by Republicans Michael Waltz, Jim Banks, and Claudia Tenney. U.S. District Judge Lynn Hughes dismissed a lawsuit by the employees of Houston Methodist Hospital System protesting their anti-vaccine position. As MNTV previously reported, 178 employees were suspended without pay for their failure to get vaccinated. Hughes wrote in his judgment that Texas law only protects employees from being terminated for refusing to commit an act carrying criminal penalties to the worker. He said that receiving a COVID-19 vaccine is not an illegal act. The judge also took issue with the lawsuit comparing the requirement to get vaccinated with Nazi medical experiments during the Holocaust. Houston Methodist includes 1 medical center and 6 community hospitals. It had initially offered vaccinated employees an extra $500 bonus in March. Meanwhile, 8 states are seeing a rise in COVID-19 infections. Johns Hopkins University reports that Alabama, Arkansas, Hawaii, Missouri, Nevada, Texas, Utah, and Wyoming have all seen cases rise in the past 2 weeks. According to the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, except for Hawaii, all of those states have lower than average vaccination rates. In news that will disappoint millions of Muslims wanting to do the Hajj, foreign pilgrims will once again not be allowed to perform the pilgrimage. Hajj will be restricted to 60,000 Saudi citizens and residents due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. The ministry added that the pilgrims must be between the ages of 18 and 65 and have no chronic diseases. Last year, only 1,000 Saudi citizens and residents were allowed to perform Hajj. Normally, up to 2 million pilgrims from around the world do so annually. Barring people from outside Saudi Arabia for Hajj is unprecedented in modern history. Leaders at the G7 summit have issued a statement calling out China's record on human rights and fundamental freedoms. They specifically spoke of the plight of the Uyghurs. Documented reports by human rights organizations have found that up to 3 million Uyghur Muslims have been detained by the Chinese government. Under the guise of vocational education and training centers, Uyghurs are kept in the detention camps. Most are tortured and many killed. Uyghur women have also been raped and sterilized by the Chinese government. Detainees who are released remain under constant surveillance. Their biometric data, such as DNA, is collected without their consent or tracking. The G7 statement also addressed the issue of Hong Kong and its need for greater autonomy. Istanbul Airport's Ali Kuşçu Mosque is the first masjid to receive a gold-level LEED certificate by the U.S. Green Building Council. LEED refers to Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. It is a certification widely used in the International Green Building Rating System. The Green Building Council assesses building on criteria such as water efficiency, sustainability, energy, atmosphere, as well as materials and resources. Most of the waste generated during the construction of the mosque was recycled. The head of the United States Central Command said that the U.S. is not planning to support Afghan troops with airstrikes after its troop withdrawal is complete. General Frank McKenzie also said that the counter-terrorism strikes in Afghanistan will be limited to instances that will affect the United States directly and American allies. There's also a plan to evacuate Afghans who help the U.S. should the need arise. President Joe Biden is withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. Ship, weapon systems, and troops have been pulled from other regions as well. A detailed analysis on this is coming up later tonight in our show, so keep watching Muslim Network News. The producer of a film on the 2019 Christchurch mosque shootings has resigned from her role. Philippa Campbell left the team after concerns were raised over recent days. Referring to the emotional scar amongst Muslims, she said the event was too raw for a film at this time. Campbell said she did not want to be involved with a project that was causing such distress. 51 Muslims, including children, were killed on March 15, 2019. An Australian white supremacist gunned down the victims during Friday prayers in 2 consecutive mass shootings at mosques in Christchurch. Andrew Niccol is the film's writer and director. He said the film is not so much about the attack, but the response to the attack. The National Islamic Youth Association of New Zealand has started a petition to halt the production of the film. The organization said any documentary on the shooting should focus on the violence and trauma experienced by the Muslims. Instead, it said the film whitewashes the horrific violence perpetrated against Muslim communities. Ratings for the head of the UK's Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, has fallen amongst British Muslims. Muslim voters have historically supported the Labour Party, but that trend seems to be shifting. A recent survey on behalf of the Labour Muslim Network showed a net drop of 12% in the favorability of the party amongst Muslims. This drop has been attributed to recent, more right-wing approach to domestic and foreign policy in the party. It can also be linked to Starmer's handling of Islamophobia within the party. An earlier report had highlighted several concerns regarding this. Zarah Sultana is the MP for Coventry South. She said Labour Party needs to give a clear message of their stance on racism and advocating justice on the world stage from Palestine to Kashmir. She also said it needs to win the trust and support of Muslim voters once again. Despite the tremendous expression of love, the fear of hate is rising amongst Canadian Muslims. The murder of 3 generations of a family in London, Ontario, has shaken the community. More details in a report by Ali Khalaf and Saleha Farouk.
Love was present in London, Canada all week long. Thousands gathered in vigils, physical as well as virtual. Thousands marched, hand in hand, with love in their hearts to show solidarity with Muslims. Hundreds prayed together with tears in their eyes. This couple drove 100 kilometers to participate in the Afzal funeral.
In the last 3 years, Syrian Muslim refugee families have come to our town with children that we love and care for. and we value their friendship very much.
In Guelph, Mohammed El Doulaimi says a few hours after the attack, my non-Muslim neighbor knocked on my door with a box full of cookies and a card signed by the family members saying that you are not just our neighbors, but our friends. God bless you continually and give you peace. That love was transmitted live to the whole of Canada. The Ottawa Police Service report shows that hate crimes were up 57% in 2020. The London murders of a Muslim family raised the tide of hate to a higher level. Why would a man hate and kill a whole family whom he did not know before? Did he become a hate monster through online forums? Was it the negative media coverage of Muslims? Was it Canada not recognizing Islamophobia as a real problem? Was it government inaction after the Quebec mosque massacre? Researchers will research. Time will tell if this love really defeats the rise of hate. While wounds of London are still fresh, hate continues to raise its ugly head. In a Zoom vigil attended by thousands of neighbors of all faiths, some hate mongers Zoom bombed it. Fawzia Mazhar, the executive director of the Women's Coalition and the organizer, led all in the vigil to calmly handle the hater. Politicians of all parties were around, showing sympathy and desire to take action. But the Prime Minister himself sounded a bit skeptical when he said, "Do we need more proof that Islamophobia exists?" Muslims are skeptical as well. Muslim women were crying in the online vigil, wondering if their hijab would make them a target. People are afraid of going out. This Muslim woman actually wants to hold politicians responsible. She says, all of this talk was done after the Quebec massacre, but no systemic change had addressed the problem.
Is this how we're going to be living our lives, just secluded in between our walls? And this is unacceptable. Leaders of this country have to step in now. It's high time to, take action now, immediately.
Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment. So stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Welcome back. Earlier tonight, we shared the recent statement from CENTCOM head about the air support of Afghan forces after withdrawal. Retired U.S. Army Major Danny Sjursen is joining Saleha Farouk for a detailed conversation. Over to you, Saleha.
Once again, much appreciated. Today, we're very happy to be joined by Danny Sjursen, who is a retired United States Army officer, as well as author and a speaker. Danny, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
Our pleasure. Now, as you might be aware, the Afghan president, Ashraf Ghani, has welcomed Washington's decision to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan by approximately September of this year. He says Afghan's security forces themselves are capable of defending their own people. But on the ground, we're hearing from local Afghanis that they're fearing actually renewed attacks by the Taliban. What do you make about this?
I think that we crystal clear and honest. I think we owe that both to the American public and to the Afghan people. And the reality is that the Taliban is and has been in the strongest military position that they've been in since they were driven essentially from power in 2001 and 2. There are major surrenders happening among the Afghan security forces. There are reports of real doubts from Afghan commanders about the ability to hold out, both from a logistical perspective, a lot of which has been provided by the American military for almost 20 years now. Also air support, medevac support for helicopters to pick up the wounded. And I think it is unrealistic for either hawkish policy advisors in the United States, working for think tanks, for example, to say that, you know, we can or we should be able to kind of stem the tide of the Taliban. And also, I think that the rhetoric that comes from Kabul is not always reflective of what is being said, especially out in the rural areas where the Taliban now control or contest, you know, upwards of 50% of the country. And that's been the case for quite some time, which I think tragically, frankly, demonstrates the limits of American power and is a real indictment, I think, in a lot of ways of the American military mission there for 20 years. Because if the country is in a worse state in terms of Taliban strength than we sort of found it once we completed the invasion, then that raises a whole lot of questions about the efficacy of American military intervention overseas.
Now, adding to that, a lot of people are showing concern as well as the lack of comprehensive planning around the so-called withdrawal of United States troops out of Afghanistan. Given how the U.S. has been in the region for approximately 19 years, what do you foresee in terms of this withdrawal and what it might look like, what it might bring in the future?
You know, it is very difficult to speculate on, you know, how long the Afghan government will hold out, whether the Kabul government will hold out at all. There's a lot of guessing that goes on. If I were a betting man, and no one knows for sure, there's human agency involved in this, but probably the country goes back to some version of de facto partition, whereby the Taliban maintains a lot of control in the rural areas, especially the Pashto areas of the south and the east. And the Kabul government starts to look more and more like the old Northern Alliance, controlling more of the north, some of the major urban metropolises. And I'm not certain that there is an enormous amount that the United States can do to meaningfully alter that, given the political calculus in Washington, but also militarily. And there's a lot of unanswered questions. For example, will the United States continue to provide air support? They're saying no now. And there was a lot of speculation that they may change their mind on that, if Kabul was about to fall, maybe even Kandahar, but certainly Kabul, that there would be U.S. airstrikes and drones. Another question is who's going to continue to secure the Kabul airport and therefore secure the ability of diplomats to get in and out, because the Biden administration has said it will continue to provide maybe not military, but certainly diplomatic and humanitarian support. That's going to require the ability to access this landlocked country. Right now, about 400 Turkish troops from NATO are guarding the airport, and it is unclear if they will stay. And if they do stay, it is unclear what the tit for tat or the quid pro quo from Erdogan will be. It seems like he wants to keep his Russian missiles. And so there's just a lot of unanswered questions. It's very difficult to speculate.
So the United States is currently stationed in a multitude of other countries as well. Do you believe that moving troops out of Afghanistan might set a precedence for the trajectory of United States troops stationed in other Middle Eastern countries as well?
Frankly, I hope so, but I'm less than optimistic. I think that Afghanistan may turn out, this would be tragic, and I have an op-ed coming out to this effect. The tragic reality is that Afghanistan could be the anomaly. It could be really the only major war that the Biden administration ends. Why would I say that? It is less than certain that Joe Biden feels the same way about other wars, other interventions as he does about Afghanistan. He has always been on generally a more skeptical footing about the Afghan war, about the American military role there. However, when it comes to smaller interventions in Africa, a small footprint in Iraq, he's proven a bit more bullish on all of that. And so I hope that it sets a certain precedent for a less militarized approach for the United States in the region, an approach that has been utterly counterproductive and failed on every single merit. It just has. It is delusional thinking to believe that U.S. military force is the best tool for interventions in the greater Middle East.
Now, you yourself are a retired military officer. Since Joe Biden took over office, he's done something that former President Donald Trump had planned to do, which is to order the full withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan, as well as to cut U.S. military support for the Saudi-led offensive in Yemen. Talk to us about this idea of resources, military resources that came out in a recent report in terms of the impact of moving things like U.S. ships and weapon systems and troops out of the Middle Eastern nations. What does that do to United States military resources and reserves?
Well, first of all, I was very pleased with at least the concept of pulling U.S. military support for the Saudi-led, frankly, terror war on the Yemeni people. There are still some open questions about, whether the United States is still complicit in allowing the blockade to continue, U.S. arms sales to the Saudis, and the UAE, U.S. support from our contractors and also from our Navy to the Saudi Navy that maintains the blockade. However, it was a positive move. The fact that we're taking ships and troops out of the greater Middle East, and that since the 2018 national security strategy for the first time shifted the #1 U.S. military priority from counterterrorism in the greater Middle East to what they call GPC. They love their acronyms. Great Power Competition, meaning Russia and China. And it has been made very clear this week, especially at the NATO conference, that the Biden administration has basically rallied Europe and Turkey, which is in Europe as well, to push towards an antagonistic posture towards China. That certainly is going to limit the finite U.S. military resources' ability to respond in the Middle East. However, since every major U.S. military intervention and response in the Middle East has been both a failure and/or counterproductive with a lot of blowback and incredibly brutal and destabilizing, then I can't say that aspect of it is necessarily a bad thing. It turns out that violence begets violence. It turns out that chickens come home to roost. And the seeds of the next disaster in the greater Middle East for the U.S. military, and thus even more so for the people that we don't talk about a lot here in the United States, the seeds of it are always in the last one. They're always in the last intervention. But I don't think it's a great idea to go off starting new Cold Wars, hair trigger, nuclear saber rattling with two major nuclear powers. I'm against militarism, not discrete military operations.
Do you believe at all that the United States is prepared to support Afghanistan with any kinds of defense mechanisms or mechanisms to defend their people after they withdraw from the region?
That remains unclear, but it's going to be very difficult. I think there's a lot of dissembling going on in Washington. A lot of times, Arlington, just across the river with the Pentagon, is on a bit of a different page from, the White House and from Congress, which doesn't really even want to be involved in war making. And what I mean by this is there was a New York Times report that was June 9th. And it said that, unnamed officials, military, national security officials were saying, actually, we're considering that we will intervene with airstrikes to defend the Kabul government, especially if major cities start to fall. But it's not more than a few days later that we get a report saying, in an exclusive interview, the head of CENTCOM, which is in control of the entire greater Middle East, including Afghanistan, Frank McKenzie, is saying, no, absolutely, we're not doing that. The only airstrikes the United States will do, the only overt airstrikes of our own, will be if there's a counter-terror operation against a plot that we've identified that's against our homeland, the United States of America, or our allies, which one think would be treaty allies, NATO allies. This seems to indicate that the U.S. military is not going to intervene to save the Kabul government. we'll see in the breach if that holds. There'll be enormous political pressure to do so. There'll be humanitarian considerations. I mean, Taliban is not exactly a human rights record champion or enthusiasts, despite their promises to the contrary. It's very difficult to know, but there are logistic reasons it's going to be very difficult to do. Because even if you fly a plane or a drone from a far distance, whether it's from an aircraft carrier or from a base, say in Bahrain, they will only be able to linger over Afghanistan for a short amount of time because of fuel. And there's the consideration of if there's a bailout, whether a U.S. pilot is shot down or a mechanical failure, whether there'll be an ability to rescue them once all these troops are out. So I think there are enormous logistical reasons to think that probably that is not what's going to happen.
Danny Sjursen, who is a retired U.S. Army officer as well as author and speaker, thank you so much for being here with us today and for your insight.
Well, thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. Back to the news studio.
Thank you, Saleha. Before moving on to our next analysis, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back after these messages.
Our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
They took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, held its 31st summit in Brussels. The leaders of 30 member countries attended the summit and issued a joint communique. To discuss the highlights of the summit, let's go to Imam Malik Mujahid, who's with Professor of History and Political Science, Dr. David Gibbs. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Hena. President Biden is in Europe. He just finished up NATO meeting. It was 31st meeting of this 30-nation military alliance. And among the interesting thing is that they have declared in their giant communique that cyber attack is like an armed attack, which is, in my view, a serious acceleration about fighting. To discuss with us is Professor David Gibbs. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
David Gibbs is a professor of history at the University of Arizona. So the NATO communication, has one thing interesting. It talks about Russia and China. Russia, it calls it serious threat. And China, they mention challenged posed by China. What do you read here?
Well, NATO is an organization that's dedicated to finding and responding to threats. And so it's a bureaucratic entity with a lot of vested interests surrounding it that is structured around the idea of threats. And it's, I suppose, natural in a certain sense that it would look at the world and view all sorts of things as threats that others with with a different orientation might not view as threats. But that is what is happening here. Is I think they're trying to find threats And they've been trying to find threats really since the end of the Cold War. Let's be very clear on this. NATO was founded in 1949 with a very specific purpose. And that purpose was to dissuade and or repel a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. And that purpose ended in 1989 with the end of the Cold War. In 1990, the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet-led alliance in Eastern Europe, dissolved. And in 1991, the Soviet Union itself disappeared. And I think since that time, it's been an institution that's been looking for a new threat. And, early on, I think a threat was humanitarian crises in Yugoslavia and elsewhere. Then it became Arab terrorism. NATO was heavily involved in the war in Afghanistan, which is now winding up. A combination of both factors was influential in the Libya intervention in 2011. And now we're seeing new efforts to find new threats, and it seems the new threats are Russia and China.
Why Russia is considered a threat, quote unquote, and while China is just mentioned as a challenge, quote unquote, are they trying to give a message to China that we don't consider you a threat? Are they telling Putin that you better watch out?
Yes, I think that there are two features here. One is that Russia is much more seen as or being presented and being created, one might say, as a threat. China, I think there's some reluctance to establish it as a threat. Mostly, I think, for economic reasons. China's becoming a major player in the world economy. There's a very extensive network of U.S. private interests that are heavily interconnected with China in terms of both trading, industry, and finance. China plays a critical role in supporting the U.S. dollar as the world currency. And the problem creating China as an enemy is it makes it very difficult to carry on normal economic interaction with China. And so there's a big, you might say, lobby group against creating China as an enemy, and that puts a constraint on the ability of the United States government to establish China as a full-fledged enemy, hence the hesitation in that statement. Russia, however, is seen very differently, and Russia is seen, I think, as a full-fledged enemy, very much a recreation of the Soviet Union of old. Some of this, I think, is intellectual laziness. If you want to find an enemy, it's very simple to focus on Russia because one thinks of Russia as being virtually the same as the Soviet Union, even if it's not. And so I think a sort of inertia and intellectual laziness is part of this process. If you have to find that enemy, I guess Russia is one that's out there, and we're used to having it as an enemy. So why not, I suppose? There's a party aspect to this as well. I think there's been very much, the Republican Party is focused much more on China as the enemy, less on Russia. The Democrats have focused more on Russia, less on China. And so the Democrats are now in power. The primary emphasis on Russia reflects to some extent a party division as well.
So tell me this. You mentioned there is a substantial lobby and interest to deal with China in a different way. So what constitute the lobby for China in America?
Well, to some extent, you think of anytime you go to Walmart or Target or any large, store, half the products you see are made in China, and so there's an enormous amount of U.S. trade with China, which has become the factory to the world. Plus, U.S. finance is very heavily dependent upon China basically pouring money into the U.S. economy. The U.S. Treasury Department, I think, is very aware of the fact that the premier holder of U.S. Treasury bonds is China and plays a critical role in upholding the U.S. dollar as the world's currency, which might not be possible if China were unwilling to finance the U.S. debt. And so that's the lobby right there, is a vast proportion of the U.S. private sector and a significant portion of the U.S. bureaucracy, most notably the Treasury Department, that is a vested interest in not going overboard in demonizing China. On the other hand, you have other vested interests that have a very different objective, notably interests associated with weapons manufacture and what Eisenhower referred to as the military-industrial complex, which is a sizable portion of the U.S. economy. I think that nominally, weapons production is 3.5% of the GDP. that's an understatement if one considers all of the unofficial, weapons procurement activities. It's probably much higher than that, probably closer to 5%, I would guess. That's a lot. That's a lot. Some of the largest companies are involved in weapons production, either directly or indirectly. And so you have a very large lobby that's in favor of demonizing both Russia and China in the interest of finding a new enemy. So I think you have two, competing factions within the U.S. establishment. I think the dominant one now, though, is we need a new enemy. And the primary one is going to be Russia. That's already begun. And China is waiting in the wings as another potential enemy. And, we've been through many iterations of this, and it can't be forgotten that it was only recently that Arab terrorism was the enemy. And that somehow went out of fashion. Now we're looking for someone else. And so it seems we're going from enemy to enemy here. And Russia and China.
Is President Biden maintaining the same type of conversation, rhetoric about China as President Trump? Do you see a major difference between both?
Rhetorically, there's definitely a difference. Trump, rhetorically was always using very charged anti-Chinese rhetoric of a sort that, many people found reasonably enough, I'd say unsavory at a number of levels. And clearly he was somebody who was making much greater emphasis to make China the primary enemy and Russia the secondary enemy. And again, that reflects, I would say, a party difference, with the Republicans focusing more heavily on China, the Democrats on Russia. But there's heavy overlap here, and one can see that Biden is demonizing both countries to some degree.
Well, if Russia is the primary threat, quote unquote, then how come United States allowed Russia to prevail in Syrian conflict?
Well, there are a lot of reasons for that. I think one of them is that, I think there's a very strong temptation in the United States to want to have decisive victory in Syria and decisively have our side win, which means some group of these Syrian rebels, and to overthrow the Assad dictatorship asymmetrically and put in power people we were backing. That is the U.S. tendency. That's what the U.S. always wants to do. And I think initially that was the policy. The problem with that policy is that limited U.S. intervention, the U.S. intervention has been somewhat limited. It hasn't been on the scale of, let's say, what we did in Iraq in 2003. Limited intervention has not been successful in overthrowing the Assad government. So the U.S. basically is at a crossroads, and the crossroads is the U.S. can either accept that Assad is likely to win the conflict, which looks probable at this point, or it could send in 100,000 troops as it did in Iraq and decisively defeat the Assad regime, overthrow the Assad regime, and put in power the Syrian rebels that we're backing. The problem with that is, in the first place, the Syrian rebels do contain a significant number of, disturbing forces, some of which do have al-Qaeda connections, at least some of them do. And, I think that's a concern to the United States, given that, it was only recently that al-Qaeda was the enemy. So I think that's one concern. And the bigger concern is that we did that in Iraq, and that didn't go very well. We did that in Afghanistan, and that didn't go very well. We did it in Libya, and that didn't go very well.
Are you saying that United States is capable of learning from what we have done in the past?
Not very much. I think that there's a disturbing tendency to not learn from past lessons, and the lesson I would learn is that intervention is a terrible way to advance human rights. At least military intervention is a terrible way to advance human rights. It has the opposite effect from what's intended. It makes human rights much worse than in the past. That's happened again and again and again. That lesson has not been learned. I think what has been learned, though, is the issue that destabilizing vast parts of the world and tying U.S. troops down for decades in unwinnable wars is extremely expensive. It's demoralizing to the military, particularly the soldiers who have to fight in the field. It really creates so many damaging secondary effects that I think there is some hesitation about doing that once again. So I think in that sense, you could say there's been a limited lesson learned, which is that actually going in with 100,000 troops, decisively defeating the enemy, putting our guys in power, can produce disastrous results. I think that is something the U.S. government is aware of. But nevertheless, the U.S. has several thousand troops in Syria. It controls significant portions of Syrian territory. The CIA has been intervening very heavily in Operation Timber Sycamore. And so what the U.S. has opted for is a medium-level intervention. not the kind we did before, but a medium-scale intervention, without any clear results or really any clear purpose at this point, other than keeping the U.S. engaged and saying America is still engaged and America hasn't given up, without any real endgame here or any prospect of an endgame.
How much of that old theory of realm of influence plays a role vis-a-vis, Ukraine or Syria? Syria has always been in the influence of Soviet Union and then Russia. So America thought, well, that this is their realm of influence, we'll do something secondary level, but nothing major. But then Ukraine, Russia claims its influence, and we are worried about it, building NATO for something, but there is no help.
Well, a basic issue you have in the Ukraine is very simple. That, there are a number of things here. I think the big issue in Ukraine is that there's always been a longstanding proposal to bring the Ukraine into NATO. And I think the Ukrainians, well, first of all, Ukraine is a divided society. People don't forget that about half of the Ukraine looks to Russia, not to the United States and the EU, as the friendly power. There's a big division between southern and eastern Ukraine, which are heavily Russian-speaking, and central and western Ukraine, which tend to be Ukrainian-speaking, often very Catholic in religion, and look to the West. And so it's a divided country. But I think a larger issue is this: it borders Russia. And from the Russian standpoint, bringing the Ukraine into NATO would be like, well, the question they would ask, which is a legitimate one, is how would the United States feel if Russia were to establish an alliance with Mexico and establish bases in Mexico and the U.S. border? And obviously the U.S. would not like it. And we know very well how the U.S. would react to any prospect of that if it were to happen. The Russians point out, and they have a point here, is that is exactly what is happening in the Ukraine. And if the Ukraine were to join NATO, it would be an anti-Russian alliance brought all the way up to a vast border with Russia. And they will not tolerate that. It is not just Putin, but I think the entirety of the Russian public, or a large percentage of them, would see this as a threat. And we should not forget, there was a U.S. promise in 1990 that was publicly made that NATO would never expand 1 inch to the east. The U.S. promised that. And that was part of a deal whereby if the Soviets, the Russians and the Soviets, would not block German reunification, the United States would agree not to expand NATO into the former communist states. The U.S. violated that again and again. And the Russians see this as a, breach of confidence, a breach of good faith on America's part. There's no question that this was a breach of an agreement. And any effort to incorporate the Ukraine into NATO would be a further iteration of this violation of the agreement, and one that the Russians would see as a threat to their security. People forget, that, Putin may not be a very nice person. He's an authoritarian figure, and it's understandable people look at him negatively. But he is speaking, I think, for a large part of the Russian public, which sees themselves as being threatened by NATO. And NATO really doesn't have a purpose. If NATO had simply gone out of business in 1990, when the Warsaw Pact went out of business, we probably wouldn't be dealing with this problem at all right now. The entire security threat emanating supposedly from Russia very likely wouldn't even exist.
Well, Professor Gibbs, here's a purpose which NATO has found. The latest communiques say that cyber attacks equate the arms attack. It means they can invoke Article 5 of NATO for collective defense. Don't you think it's a major acceleration?
There's no doubt there's been a continuous escalation of security threats emanating from everything NATO's been doing in the last few years. And this issue of, sort of seeing a cyber attack as being the equivalent to an arms attack, which is a wildly implausible comparison, is again a very provocative statement that can only escalate tensions and really does run the risk of eventually causing a war. And we should not forget that Russia still has 1,000 nuclear warheads that are active and several thousand in storage. This could very easily escalate, and yes, it could lead to nuclear war. There's a certain frivolity to all of this, a certain willingness to play with fire, which is what NATO and Biden have been doing here, that I for one, find somewhat disturbing.
President Biden had publicly called Putin a killer, and he doubled down on that. So how these international leaders meet each other eye to eye when they have called each other these type of names?
Well, on the one hand, you have an issue that there's no doubt that Putin is an authoritarian figure. There have been disappearances of journalists and opposition figures, and people are rightly suspicious of of Putin as having killed them. I don't think we have definitive evidence, but circumstantial evidence suggests there's a likelihood in a number of cases. There have been several dozen cases over the last 20 years of this, and that is disturbing, and that does deserve condemnation. I don't think that is a U.S. motive here. I think that's a pretext, however, and the reason is this. In the 90s, Putin's predecessor, Boris Yeltsin, you also had disappearances of figures, okay? You had merely a much worse human rights record than Putin has by any standard, more killings by any standard than you had under Putin. But he was America's best friend, okay? He was considered a wonderful figure. He was lionized by the U.S. President Clinton at the time and the U.S. media at the same time. Why? Because he was doing what America wanted him to do, all right? So I think that's the issue. I think this is a weaponization of human rights. I mean, again, it's correct to criticize Putin for his human rights violations. But again, it's being done in such a cynical and inconsistent way. I find it very difficult to take seriously as a genuine motive here. And it should not get in the way, even if we consider Putin a killer, and I think it likely is a killer. Fact is, America's backed killers all the time. And that should be taken into account here. Yes, that is significant. There is a consistency issue. But there's another issue. The world has a human right to be free of war, and especially nuclear war. And that, to me, is a more important priority than condemning Putin's human rights violations. And again, Biden is in really not a very good position to condemn the human rights violations, since in the 90s, he was totally supportive of Yeltsin. No criticism of Yeltsin. And to me, what that suggests is the issue is not human rights. It's Russia acting independently of U.S. objectives. And America doesn't believe Russia has the right to act like an independent country. And I think that really is the issue, is that, America likes countries that are under its thumb. And Russia isn't under America's thumb. And I think that's the issue here. And, I don't, human rights violations, as real as they are, as worthy of condemnation as they are, I don't think that's the motive here.
Professor Gibbs, do you think there's any chance in the tenure of President Biden to have some serious conversation on reducing the threat of nuclear warfare?
There's a very simple way to do that, in my view. The first one is to basically declare the United States will allow no further expansion of NATO. The Ukraine and Georgia will not be ever permitted into NATO. That will tremendously improve security in the United States, in the world. And that would be number one. I think that the U.S. has to basically put back on the table something that was proposed in the late 80s by Gorbachev in the Soviet days, and probably was a viable option in the 90s, which is bilateral disarmament. Gorbachev proposed a complete elimination of nuclear weapons by both countries, which in those days had a much larger percentage of worldwide nuclear weapons. That was put as a serious option on the table, and the U.S. firmly rejected it. The U.S. flat out refused to do it. I think bilateral disarmament and eventually worldwide nuclear disarmament is something that has to be entertained, but the U.S. has to be willing to consider it. And so far, the America's position has been under no circumstances will the U.S. ever consider giving up its nuclear arsenal. And that has to stop, because that's a huge threat to global security. That's a much bigger threat to global security than anything Putin is being accused of doing.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Gibbs. Appreciate you. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Back to you, Hena.
Thank you so much, Imam Mujahid and Professor Gibbs. That's all from our Washington studios tonight. Thank you for turning into our show. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube channel or Facebook page. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Assalamu alaikum and good night.